Welcome again, everyone, to TNS Radio Ireland. I am Mike Montagne, original 1968 architect of Mathematically Perfected Economy, speaking on Mathematically Perfected Economy and Absolute Consensual Representation. Archives of this program are available at tnsradio.com under the category Mike Montagne and from the domain perfectedeconomy.org. Original material, analyses, and solution, as always, are copyrighted and trademarked by Mike Montagne. All rights, and therefore claims of authority, are reserved. Copies of this program can be downloaded and distributed freely only so long as the entirety of this program, including this copyright and trademark notice, remain intact. Who and what are our greatest enemies? On the one hand, we have 43-year-old proofs that as a regular consequence of no more than maintaining a vital circulation, subject to the present obfuscation of our promissory obligations, any purported economy, subject to interest, inherently terminates itself under terminal sums of artificial debt. Plagiarists of my work, who have never yet even once articulated the problem so that we could possibly truly understand it, have called the process we have to understand a debt virus or Ponzi scheme. To this day, no one has invalidated the original thesis. At the same time, it is impossible to understand the real problem or its solution from the definition of a Ponzi scheme. I've asked literally thousands of people to explain the problem or its solution or solutions, if a multitude of possible solutions indeed exists, from the definition of a Ponzi scheme. No one yet has been able to do so, because the problem isn't a Ponzi scheme. And so this is a very important, if otherwise irrelevant fact. A divisive distraction introduced by no more than plagiarists and the blind who follow them away from solution, telling each other a thing which can't even be understood because it isn't even true. Even on this program, we have explained over and over and over again, first, that it is necessary to maintain a vital circulation. When an obfuscation of our currency forces us, in only fulfilling our promissory obligations to each other, to pay principal and interest out of a circulation which at most can be comprised of no more than some remaining principal. The very obfuscation of our promissory obligations to each other forces us to borrow back into circulation what we pay out of a circulation. As we have explained, however, all money is first created. It doesn't even exist to borrow before it is created. Moreover, it doesn't either exist as evidence of property of a purported banking system. We, however, do monetize commerce or trade of our production by issuing promissory obligations, which, as we have explained, are inherently obligations to pay and to retire principal from circulation. Because the real creditor, who gave up whatever property is represented and therefore is redeemable in the resultant circulation, is paid in full from the outset of the arrangement. As a consequence of the natural principles of unexploited promissory obligations, only then, the resultant circulation immutably represents and is always redeemable in the remaining value of the related property, if and only if the obligor or issuer of the promissory obligation, as opposed to purported debtor, if and only if the obligor pays and retires the principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property. No private person, corporation, or whatever, of course, has a right exclusive to the rest of us, or excluded from the rest of us, to exploit our promissory obligations. But why does the banking system, in particular, have no right or justifiable claim either to the principal or the interest? We've explained this too on just this program many times over. But can we know the answer from the definition of a Ponzi scheme or the loose imitative illusion of a debt virus? Absolutely not. Worse, do these imitations lead us to understand the fact of singular solution the purported authors only stole from? Absolutely not either. So why does the banking system, in particular, have no right or justifiable claim either to the principal or the interest of the purported debts we repay to a banking system wrongly? As we have explained over and over and over again, we do not borrow money from banks. The bank merely usurps our right to issue our promissory obligations. And thus, rather than loaning us money it earned or possessed, instead, when money is created, and as this is the origin of all such obfuscated money, this is the beginning of what we have to understand. When money is created, all the banking system does is issue evidence of our promissory obligation. All it does is create another representation of our promissory obligation, which is inherently to retire payment of the principal from circulation. The paid principal, moreover, is the property of no one. But why? Only the unpaid principal, the circulation, represents value or earned wealth. Paid principal represents consumption of the value of property, which value no longer even exists. Paid principal is a fulfilled IOU. It is the rightful property of no one. It represents no wealth whatever. On the contrary, it can only represent consumed wealth. We say, in our perpetual ignorance of the obfuscation of today's money changers, that interest is justified because the bank risks its wealth. We say we have to borrow money from banks. We say no one would lend us money if it weren't subject to interest. But how do we borrow something which doesn't even exist as property of a purported banking system? We don't. Think whatever we may, wrongly, the banking system merely publishes evidence of our promissory obligations, which are not debts to the bank at all. They are never debts to the bank. But why not? Do we learn or understand the answer from the definition of a Ponzi scheme? Absolutely not. What we wrongly say we borrow from banks is never even the property of the bank. Not now, not when money comes into existence, nor ever afterward. But why not? Because the purported banking system never gives up lawful consideration equal to the debt it ever wrongly claims from us. If there were a debt to the bank would have to have given up to us, the purported debtors, so much as the very thing of value for which we issue our promissory obligation. When we purportedly borrow the money for a house, then, we would have to get 2 houses if we owed the bank a house too, just in principle. We get the house from the real creditor, who gives up the house in exchange for our promissory obligation. In its gross, purposed injustices, the purported banking system merely pretends to be a creditor. But it does not truly grant credit. We who produce all the things that exist do, for we accept our promissory obligations, hoping they tokenize our production in some way that allows us to receive for our endeavors the equivalent of our own production. But this is not only impossible under the purported banking system's obfuscation of our promissory obligations. In fact, on the contrary, a perpetual multiplication of falsified, artificial indebtedness in proportion to a remaining capacity to service debt eventually dispossesses us of all our production, transferring all wealth from its producers to a handful of the most vicious, destructive criminals against all mankind, who produce nothing, not only to take everything from us, but even to deny us our very means of production. In the end, the system inevitably fails because the means of unjustifiable dispossession multiplies the periodic magnitude of dispossession in proportion to capacity to pay, until we can no longer meet the demands of the method of stealing from us, and we succumb to unrecoverable terminal failure. This is what Thomas Jefferson would have meant if he indeed said, "If the American people ever allow the banks to issue their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations which will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake homeless on the continent their fathers had conquered." Why is this failure terminal, and how does this happen? No debt is owed to the bank, for the obligation to pay principal is an obligation to retire principal. The bank never gave up lawful consideration equal to the purported debt it wrongly claims from us. So the first crime of the purported banking systems which have been imposed upon the world is that they wrongly launder principal into the possession of the purported banks. Instead of retiring payments of principal, which in fact the banking system did not even loan, although it claims to, principal is considered property of the purported banking system.